So let's look at it. So here is, we put this together a long time ago, but it's the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Giants is a very, very small scroll. It consists of two pieces, but since it's this kind of literature and corroborates not just the Book of Enoch, which is from the Ethiopic and may or may not be 100% accurate, this is a Dead Sea Scroll saying the same thing. So I went ahead and put that in our translation of Enoch. And so it's we've got the whole book of Enoch in here, and then other theories and stuff like the sons of God of Genesis 6, the four theories, the history of the Nephilim, the warring clans, what all happened, synopsis, and then Appendix C is the Book of Giants. So that's what we want to look at tonight. So let me get this here. So I'll just read you the intro to this. There's two pieces of it. One is historical and prophetic, which is kind of interesting of itself. But the other one is a scientific journal, basically describing how you do genetic tampering. So the entire book of Enoch is preserved in the Ethiopic church, and that's the only place we have the whole thing. And when we look at that, I think that there are pieces of it that have been added. And obviously, there's a problem with the translation. Jubilees and Enoch from the Ethiopic, even if it's 100% accurate, the dates are wrong. Much like when we use the Septuagint, it's just the Bible, but the dates are off. Somebody's dates are off. There's a difference in the dates. So that's why we kind of debate on what would have happened, what would the right date be. So we have that kind of stuff. So that's that from that church. So parts of it do exist in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there are whole chapters. The Dead Sea Scroll version of the Enoch calendar, for instance, helped us figure out a mystery because we kept trying to make the leap cycle a certain way because of the way it sounds like it in the Book of Enoch in Ethiopic, and it wasn't. So the original Hebrew really will explain everything. So among these fragments of Enoch that were found, there is also something that's called the Book of Giants. It's Enoch type literature, but it's not anything directly related to the Book of Enoch. So these Dead Sea Scroll fragments prove to be a previously unknown chapter of the story, so to speak, of Enoch. They're badly fragmented, but they provide quite a bit of details on the practices of the fallen ones. So, and then we just give an example. When we're talking about a Dead Sea Scroll, they're usually from the area of Qumran, well, and other places, but if they're from Qumran, it has a Q in it. So there's been some 50 caves that have been archaeologically looked at very carefully, most of which don't have anything in them. So out of those 53, I believe, there have been 12 now where we have found actual writing of some sort or something, pottery with writing or whatever. So in this case, Q for Qumran, it would be 1 through 12, meaning the cave, and then Q, and then the number of fragments, however many there were, found in that cave. So in this case, compiling Dead Sea Scroll fragments 1Q23, 2Q26, 4Q 530, 31, and 32, and then 6Q8, we come up with a good section of the original Book of Giants. You can tell it's all the same thing. Anyway, it's badly fragmented, so some of the details are guesses, but it's made up of two sections, and we want to look at this first section. The first section is of the work tells how the fallen angels descended from heaven and studied all types of creatures from insects to mammals to birds and even mankind. So they know what they're doing, they know what they're looking for, but they have to study and compare and look at things to figure out exactly how to do what they want to do. So basically, it says that they took 200 of each kind of animal, birds, and all these kind of things, and crossbred them with other kinds of animals that had a similar chromosome count. Okay, and so we'll get to this here in just a little bit. But that creates an unstable life form. Most of us know you can mate two different kinds of dogs or two different kinds of cats because they're very, very similar anyway. But you can't really cross a dog and a cat together. It just doesn't work. Well, if you could get the cat and the dog to have an unstable chromosome count and then use certain herbs to stop a spontaneous abortion, if it's done just right, it actually could work. That's what this is saying. And I would not know how to do that. But compared to today's DNA research, if it did work, that's how it would work. And that's what I think is interesting comparing this. It's like this apparently is not a made up story because it would be totally weird if it was. Somehow they knew what they were talking about. So, one example given in the text is sheep, and we know that sheep has a 54 chromosome count. Okay, goats have 60 chromosomes, but you cross a sheep and a goat, they're close enough that you can actually make a half sheep, half goat. So, this half sheep, half goat creature would have 56 or 57 chromosomes, and it's not normal. And the same thing happens like with a donkey and a horse, it makes a mule. Now, in that case, almost always the mule is sterile. Not always. And that's what's really interesting. A lot of people think, no, it's always sterile. It's not always sterile. So, if you were trying to do this experiment and you were like a king and you could command things and you're wealthy and all this stuff, it talks about the fact they wouldn't even attempt this kind of stuff unless they had 200 sets. So, if you had 200 horses and 200 donkeys, there'd be at least 200 mules the first time, and then if you kind of rotated to get slightly different genetics, did it again, rotated, did it again, you'd eventually have several hundred, just in a few years, several hundred mules, out of which a handful would probably be able to reproduce. And those are the ones you would take for stage two, combining it with something else. So that's the whole concept of what they taught. So only a few hundred pair of combinations would have the ability to in a few hundred, only just a few would have that ability to reproduce. Um, if it's that kind of thing, some would and some won't. So these unstable life forms were crossed with other unstable life forms with a chromosome count not too different from their own, and or however that would work. And this process was continued until the desired creature was created. So, in the ancient book of Jasher, for instance, it mentions the crossbreeding of cattle with birds. Now, it's interesting in Jasher, it gives you this story and it doesn't say angels of God or sons of God. It just says the leaders did this. And at first, you're thinking, like, yeah, just some leaders. Yeah, but nomads that have leaders can't figure out who has the right chromosome count to make this work. So, whatever leaders or rulers were causing this to work, they if they were just nomads, they had some sort of supernatural knowledge or something, because you don't just randomly try this stuff and get any success. So anyway, but it mentions breeding cattle with birds. Now, it doesn't mean, if you look at it carefully in Hebrew, it doesn't mean two different kinds of cattle making a brown cow and two different kinds of bird making a pretty blue feathered bird. It's mixing the cattle and the birds. So that gives us like some of our legends of like a Pegasus. Don't know if there ever was a Pegasus, but it's that kind of concept that they're talking about. Maybe it didn't fly. I don't know, but they did it for some reason, some sort of genetic reason. Okay, so here's a reconstruction of that first section, just so that we get the idea. So when the fallen, this is from the first fragment, 1Q23, fragments 9, 14, and 15. Again, some pieces are very, very small, and I wish we had the whole book, but this is enough to give us a really, really good count. So it says, when the fallen angels came, and that's fairly specific. So the Dead Sea Scroll people believed that the sons of God were fallen angels. Okay. So when the fallen angels came, they brought great sin upon the earth. Using the secrets of heaven that they knew, they killed many people and animals, and they begot giants. Okay, so killing people and animals is one thing. They killed them with certain knowledge that we didn't know about. So whatever that is. Now, in the book of Enoch, it talks about they taught things like poisons and then antidotes to poisons and metals and stuff like that. So we didn't know much about creating swords and shields and things like that. That's some of the things that they helped mankind create. But anyway, it says they studied everything the earth produced, the fruit, the grains, the trees, along with the creeping insects, up to the great fish, the beasts, reptiles, the flying birds, and other things. So basically, this is telling us that they studied all these things. Now, what would they be studying other than, according to this, how to mix genetic stuff? So they studied them intensely for some reason. Something, and again, we've got things here, but something about being very harsh. They had an oath, and of course, the oath is mentioned in detail in the Book of Enoch. So we're talking about the 400 or the 200 that came down and did the oath on Mount Hermon. Something about it being male and female and among humans, something. So this genetic stuff, it starts with insects and goes up to that. Now, today, nobody's trying to create a master race. At least I don't think we're still trying to do that, eugenics. But people, at least they tell us anyway, they're trying to figure out if you have a certain disease, it's probably because of a certain genetic mutation. If you could pinpoint that, you could change the code, and boom, the person would not have the disease anymore. That sounds like a wonderful idea. And in the back of this book, I've got several examples. This was written almost a decade back, but I gave several examples at the time of some of the different genetic things that they were doing. And there's some amazing stuff that was going on back then, all under the guise of trying to make, better things. Like if you have bad lungs and you're going to die and there's no human lung transplant you could do, like the pig, for instance, they say is the closest, but it's still not right. Well, if you could genetically modify the pig's lungs just in two or three little places, it would be much closer to a human's. That kind of stuff is what they were trying to do. So in this case, they were doing something about using the secrets to heaven. They killed a lot of people and a lot of animals doing this, whatever it is. They studied everything from the plant kingdom, fish, beasts, reptiles, flying birds, and then humans. And they did something with their oath. So if we plug this into Enoch, we know the rest of the story. So the fragments go on, and it says, here's fragment 1Q23. It says, they took 200 donkeys and asses, 200 rams and goats, 200 of the beasts of the field, including various types of animals and birds, for the purpose of mixing species. So again, you could read this if you're trying to downplay it and say donkeys and asses, or horses and donkeys making mules, goats and sheep making some, people still do that because mules are great for packing or transporting stuff. And then the sheep goat combination has a lot more meat on it. So in a place where you don't have much food, that's something that they still do a lot of. But various types of animals and birds for the purpose of mixing species. So it's not, again, two different kinds of bird to have a blue feathered creature, and certain types of animals to have two horns or one horn, or round horns or whatever. You're talking about mixing the species to combine all that somehow. Now it goes on and says the angels defiled their women. And then this is from Genesis 6, the women that they took as wives. They defiled their women, who begot giants and monsters. Now, giants, of course, is the generic form would be like just a really big, tall guy, but they're a giant in some way. They're human, they're not human, they're whatever. And then there were these monsters. Now, in the book of Jubilees, it talks about Out of the three main clans, there were the Nafal, the Giants, and then the Elu. And we're probably talking about Elu at this point. My understanding from Jubilees is that the fallen angels did this stuff and their creations were close to perfect, basically. Um, those guys did the same thing, or as they procreated, it didn't work so well. And then the humans tried to follow along and do the same kind of thing, and that's where the Elu came from, and that was a disaster. It also talks about, in another manuscript, talks about when Canaan came and built Zidon. He went up the coast. The reason he did this is because he went up the coast quietly and then founded Zidon. Because along the coast, Zidon would be the closest seaport that you could have to go straight over to Mount Hermon, which is where the angels had originally come down. And he had hoped to find some sort of written records. And according to what Jubilees says, he found certain written records that explained how this would work. And the next thing you know, we have giants in the land of Canaan when Moses and Joshua go in there. So it's a really interesting thing. If you believe the Bible, I'm not trying to prove anything, but if you believe the Bible, somehow those things happen. And so these are explaining to us, again, how these things happen. Now, these guys were known to be 100% accurate prophets. And as we study the scrolls, we'll see the prophecies and all sorts of really cool things for the first coming and for the second coming. So all of it seems to be good. The herbal medicine stuff that they talk about, we're beginning to use some of that, and it seems to be doing a great job. So if all of this is correct, this would probably be correct too, except this sounds so incredible. But then again, explaining about how you crossbreed to create unstable life forms, and then they're not giving us enough information here for us to recreate it, but it's enough for us to say, okay, this is how it's done. And then we go to modern day DNA science and we realize if possible, and if it was done back then without knowing, having computers and mapping out the genomes and all that, that's the only way that it would have happened if it did actually work. So to have a story that is actually credible and not totally made up fiction is almost impossible. So anyway, so it says the angels defiled their women who begot giants and monsters. The entire earth was corrupted by this blood and the hand of the giants who devoured much flesh. Now, that to me makes it sound like that they were really big. You and I both know that if we go to a restaurant and we order 3 or 4 or 5 hamburgers, we're going to get overweight. We're going to die pretty quick because we don't need that much food. Now, on the other hand, if instead of being like I'm 5'9", if I was 6'9" or maybe 7'4", like some really big people are, I could probably eat 5 or 6 or 7 hamburgers and it would just be a normal meal for me. So if these giants were like Goliath or bigger than Goliath, for instance, if they were 10, 12, 15 feet tall, I could see them eating everything in sight. And there's a lot of Indian legends, even over here, about the old giants and the things that they did. So they all match the stories. So what the giants did not eat, the monsters attacked. So that's really interesting. So there's some things that the original and the fall wouldn't eat, and those kind of things the other created beings ate. Okay, next fragment says, the flesh of all the monsters, and again, we're talking about, and who knows how to translate it exactly, but the non-Nephal, the other one, probably the Elu, some subgroup here, it says, the flesh of all the monsters, not the Nephal, something. They would always arise without a true understanding and knowledge of the earth, grew so corrupt that they were considering something. Probably, I would assume if it was getting that bad for food wise, you would consider cannibalism, course, you're not talking about eating people at that point. You'd be talking about your own species, whatever these guys were. Or maybe they are talking about eating people. It doesn't say, but the point is that the flesh of the monsters was different, and that's why they could eat things that the Nephal could not eat. They arose without understanding. So the Nephal were actually very intelligent, and they in the angels and stuff, and they did things with a purpose. So if you were helping them in some way, they would reward you. These guys kind of like it almost seems like they're animalistic. They get hungry, and the next thing they just kill people. So different sets of people or different sets of beings. But anyway, it says they're different from the angels, but in the end, it would always perish and die, and it caused even greater corruption in the earth. So again, not sure exactly what we're talking about, but we can gather from this there's definitely a difference between, as Jubilee says, the three different kinds. So we've got some sort of a civil war brewing, some sort of them either attacking humans or the other guys, and it always ends in disaster. So it's not like a decent race that's intelligent. Somehow, when these things are around, it's always bad. Like in America 100 years ago, they would have large packs of wolves running through the forest, just different places. That's bad. You get a pack of wolves together, you don't survive. It's not like your friendly dog. It's just they're wild animals and it always ends bad. So that's kind of what we're describing here. Okay, so a couple of points. According to the books of Enoch and Jubilees, there were 200 angels that had children with women, and they were called giants. Later, another species was created called the Nephal, and the details are sketchy, but most scholars seem to suggest the Nephal were the children of the giants. You'd have to be there to know the details, I guess, but dramatically inferior to the giants themselves. So it's inferior enough that it's like you're not one of those, you're one of these. So anyway, later another species rather, excuse me, was created probably by mankind. It was called the Elu or the Eluid. In Jubilees, it was called that anyway, and they were inferior. The giants were at war with the Nephal. The Nephal hated the Elud, and the Elud hated and hunted mankind. It's an interesting note, though, that they said even though this civil war was going on, nobody attacked their own kind except for man. For some weird reason, we like to hunt the other tribe of men and kill them off. And everybody, even the Elu and the Nephal and the giants, thought we were like insane. Why would you do that? I kill the. If we're out in the wilderness and there's a bear or a wolf that's going to attack and eat all of us, we're going to kill the bear and the wolf. If you just show up, I'm going to say, thank God another human's here. Come help. And I'll share my food. Let's try to get out of this alive. And not so much with human beings. Really interesting. Let's see. And then the second section is about some other things. So that's basically it in a nutshell that I wanted to kind of show to us. So basically, if we go back to, with this in mind, then we go back to Genesis, it says that there were giants in the earth in those days, and like it says in the Aramaic translation, the Targum, that it was in those days of the time of Azazel, and even after that, when the 200 came and had this event happen. So this is all described, and so this is why Moses is saying, that whole bad situation, this is when it happened. And God said, I'm done. 120 years, you wipe these guys out, you repent, you do what's right, or I'm wiping everything out. And you can kind of understand why that's the case. A lot of times people say God is really cruel because he would command them to, come into a certain area and destroy everything. And they talk about how they killed men, women, and children, and that seems to be really cruel. Continue reading. Men, women, children, kill and burn all of the cattle, burn all the crops, burn all of the houses and the wood. Why would you do that? You could take that good food and stuff if it's diseased. And so, on those rare occasions when there's some major disease, they want to burn even the houses and the crops and get food somewhere else. You don't want to eat diseased food. So it's interesting when you know the rest of the story, it actually makes good sense. So we'll stop there for tonight, but this is again just the section on the Book of Giants, the first half of it that we have. So to summarize, Genesis 6 talks about angels coming down and doing genetic tampering. According to this Dead Sea Scroll, it explains how the genetic tampering was done. And if it was possible and something like that did really occur, it would, we know today by knowing normal DNA stuff and mapping out the human genome, that if it was possible, it would have to be done in a certain way. You can't just magically drink milk and have that change change you into something else. There's no magic drink that does that. So the way they describe the process is exactly the way and the only way it might actually work. So you pull all this together, it's a really interesting piece of history. And we could go on if we had time, but talk about the Civil War that happened and all the other things that happened. So the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, which is a very, very small Dead Sea Scroll. And again, the scrolls, all the way through the scrolls, will make mention of the giants and the fallen angels and what they did, and give you a clue here and there. Church fathers are all the same. They'll talk about the fallen angels and what they did. And it's interesting to me, it wasn't until about 150 AD that one of the church fathers said the Book of Enoch was heresy. It was made up stuff. Everybody had accepted it fine until then. It wasn't scripture. It's not supposed to be in the canon, but it was supposed to be considered accurate history. So they considered it legitimate. But this guy started teaching that it was heretical. And that's when you get the Sethite Canaanite idea that pops out. But what's interesting is a few 50 or so years before, the idea of Sethites and Canaanites, where it was originally created by a Gnostic cult called the Sethites. And they wrote a Gnostic work, a fake work, called I think it's called the Stele of Seth, something like that. And in there, they describe the Sethites as being like angels incarnated. So you can see how we kind of get that. It's a messing up of the history, and then someone reads that and says, "Oh, okay, well they just meant they're angelic, they're godly." So and then they start changing the story. So that's why I always thought it's interesting to look at the early church fathers, because if the first 40 or 50 of them in the first 100 years all teach the same thing, then all of a sudden the story changes. You have a pretty good idea of what proper theology is. Like all the early church fathers were premillennial, so amillennialism came in later, pretty obvious. Of course, there's arguments for that kind of thing, but still, it's interesting to me to see that. What did they believe about the gifts of the Spirit? Do they ever cease? When do they cease? How do you get saved? Can you lose your salvation? What about the second coming? What about this? What about that? So if they all teach the same thing, you plug in the Dead Sea Scrolls and you get everything and how it was taught before the New Testament time from the New Testament, and then the early church fathers right after the New Testament. And everything is consistent in theology, your theology's right. So we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight.